Professor Pelly, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
A pleasure to be here.
Let me start right away with the first question. What key differences do you observe between left and right-wing populism in the US, in particular the role of evangelicals in American right populism, and how do these movements draw differently from America's religio-cultural history? Could you elaborate on the American religio-political background from which populist beliefs emerge, and explain how this historical and cultural trajectory influenced Trump's election in 2016?
Well, that's a series of very complex questions. Let me take that step by step. You asked about left wing and right wing populism. So let me begin by saying that following prominent research, I have developed a minimal definition, a core definition of populism. And then we can talk about left and right, strong and weak. But the core definition is that populism is a response to duress, loss, threat, fear of loss, anxiety about economic situations, way of life situations, changes in technology, demographics, gender roles, etc. When losses or fear of loss accumulates, people normally, as a human response, move their concentration from their usual focus on their own groups, their own friends, their own families, their own schools, their own teams, etc., outward. They shift the focus outward to a them who is causing the harm to us. They shift to an us-them focus. This is a completely normal human response. It's not European, it's not American in particular, it's not left-wing, it's not right-wing. It's a species response. We look outward for a them who is causing us the harm or the fear of the harm. The third prong, duress, us-them shift, and the third prong is who's the them, right? Groups have to find some way to identify who is the them that is causing them the duress. And these are usually located and identified in culturally familiar others. And that will differ from culture to culture, from subculture to subculture, or even sub-subculture to sub-subculture. For example, we don't hear in the United States very much about the Roma because the Roma play a very small, negligible part in America's culture and history. But in other parts of the world, you will hear a lot about the Roma as a historical them, a culturally familiar, historically long-standing them, who might be responsible for some of the harms or fears that you're feeling. So the them in the us-them binary draws from, not fully determined by, that's an overly determinist view, but draws from the pool of background ideas, usually about society, who's in and who's out, and about the proper role and size of government. So to wrap up, we have a core definition of populism: duress, prodding an us-them binary, and identifying thems in culturally familiar, long-standing others, drawn from the locations, culture, and history. The difference between left-wing and right-wing populism is who are the thems? The traditional left-wing, let me start here, the traditional right-wing approach is that the thems are outsiders, new immigrants, old immigrants, religious minorities, racial, ethnic minorities, and possibly a corrupt government. The left wing traditionally locates the thems not in government, because the left-wing approaches often see democratic government as representing the people and an appropriate agent of governance. So that's one difference between left and right. The suspicion of government is more traditionally a right-wing characteristic, and again, not 100%, but traditionally. And the left-wing populism traditionally sees government as a representative of the people in democratic societies, in representational government, and therefore the correct agent of governance. So, and left-wing populism often, again, not 100%, identifies them in terms of economic abuse rather than in identity politics, rather than in others such as racial, ethnic, religious minorities, immigrants, and so on. So those are two basic differences between left-wing and right-wing populism. I should also note very quickly that populism is not one static thing. It's on a continuum with the normal agonistic aspects of democratic processes. From a soft populism, one might think of Bernie Sanders as soft populism. One might think of Martin Luther King as soft populism, rather close to the normal processes of democratic debate. As you move along the continuum, one can move into stronger and stronger populisms, characterized by a much stronger us-them binary and a lack of ambiguity. Can someone be an ally on one issue and a opponent on another? On a softer populism, that dealing with ambiguity is possible. A corporation, for example, could be very good on climate change, and your opponent on minimum wage. And a softer populism sees that as part of the complexity of politics. A strong populism has a much firmer us-them division and often sees the struggle as one between good and evil as an existential stakeout, with much more dire approaches, therefore, to solutions. The second half of your question about cultural history and so on was very broad. And I'm wondering if you could narrow that down for me.
Yes, indeed. Maybe
I'm going to take some water.
Sure. Maybe you can elaborate on the role of evangelicals in American right-wing populism.
So I'm going to separate between white evangelicals and evangelicals of color, because they have very different histories in the United States. And evangelicals of color have a very rich and vibrant and robust history that deserves its own study. My research has been on white evangelicals. I will focus on them. White evangelicals and their ancestors have been coming to the United States since the 17th century. And they have contributed to and participated in the development of the United States. Their ancestors participated in three of the most foundational aspects of American political culture. One is covenantal political theory that sees the governed as a covenanted community, that sees sovereignty in the covenanted people, not in the king or the prince, and that sees that it is legitimate, that if the administrator, we might call them the president or the prime minister, if the administrator of the covenanted community violates covenant with the governed, that person may be legitimately removed. And that's a very productive heritage. And the ancestors of today's evangelicals contributed to that to the United States. They also participated in contributing republicanism, small r, the Aristotelian idea that the citizens of the polis run the polis. Again, a community look and also a sovereignty in the people understanding of governance. Evangelicals also contributed to the third important aspect of sort of the American political culture, liberalism, which is less concerned with embeddedness in covenanted community or republic, and more concerned with individual opportunity, but still very suspicious of a government or a ruler that would abuse the rights of the people. So that suspicion of a corrupt or a tyrannical government runs through all three of those components. The suspicion of the leader who violates covenant. Second, the suspicion of the tyrant who attempts to take over the republic. And third, the suspicion and wariness of a leader who attempts to constrain individual opportunity. Evangelicals coming to this country contributed to all three, as did other immigrants to the United States. Evangelicals have two other important factors that contributed to their position today in the right wing of American politics. And one is the doctrinal belief that all governments are fallen, none are perfect, none are the kingdom of God. And therefore, each person has to come to his or her own assessment of how to live a moral life and how to have a moral society. And that again reinforces a suspicion of authority. Evangelicals that we're talking about in the United States are Protestants, and they're heirs of the Protestant Reformation, emphasizing the role of the individual conscience in developing a moral life and society. Again, not relying on priestly authority, not relying on authority, but relying on the individual conscious. And therefore, you can see again a doubling up of this wariness of government. Is it going to turn out to violate our covenant, our republic, our liberal rights, our doctrinal obligation to identify the moral life? A wariness of government that might do that. And also a wariness of outsiders who may interfere with our way of life to do all those things. With that heritage, evangelicals have a strong background in wariness of government and often wariness of outsiders. That has a very positive side. The suspicion or a wariness of government can be a very healthy background against authoritarianism, a very strong support for democracy, and a very strong support for individual opportunity. A strong sense of community can be very important for community development. And localism and community commitment is a very strong outworking of the history I just described in the United States. But look what happens under duress. We've got, on one hand, a democratic localism a focus on community, which is both a very strong American history and a very strong evangelical commitment for the reasons just described. But under duress, that commitment to community, right, in us-them shift flips outward, and the focus from the usual commitment to community becomes a wariness and suspicion of outsiders who might damage our community. So we have a very interesting shift from the robust aspects of community commitment under duress to us-them shift to a focus who out there might damage our community. And second, which also under duress, the suspicion or wariness of tyrannical government becomes a suspicion or wariness of government per se. Remember, because under duress, people are under pressure. They want to find a them who is causing them harm. Thinking is not so subtle under pressure. We all know that. That's a species phenomenon. It's nobody's fault. But under those conditions of duress, a wariness, a healthy wariness of autocratic government becomes a suspicion of government per se. Except for one thing, which is government should be used possibly to constrain outsiders. So in my research, I looked at these two wonderfully robust aspects of American cultural background, a commitment to democratic community democracy and a healthy suspicion of government. And under duress, the great irony is those switch from a healthy community focus to a suspicion of outsiders in the United States, that's usually minorities and new immigrants, and a suspicion from tyrannical government to government per se. And those phenomena make it very, very hard for a society to function if government per se is suspect and if outsiders who may bring in a great deal of talent, innovation, entrepreneurialism, if they too are suspect. There's one final tragedy I want to mention here, and we can talk about it in future questions if you like, is that in us-them shift, you not only get a distortion from community to suspicion of outsiders, from suspicion of tyrants to suspicion of all government, you also lose the nuance to identify the sources of the original duress. In today's complex global economies, transportation, communication, hardship, economic problems, way of life problems, technological problems, and so on, usually have manifold, complex, interacting causes. And that can feel very daunting. And it can feel like you, as an individual, cannot do anything about them. And us-them shift provides a simple them as the cause of duress, but it may prevent people from seeing the more complex causes of what the problems are. And in my research, I have found that those problems are usually very real and very justified. People generally know when they are being pinched.
All right.
The tragedy is if they can't properly identify the cause of that pinch.
Right. We know that it is not only Trump, but other Republicans as well addressed economic and way of life duress. But what made Trump's policies so effective and persuasive in garnering the votes? In what ways does the evangelical sense of cultural and political marginalization influence their embrace of Trump's rhetoric and policies on immigration and national identity?
Okay, again, complex question. Just one moment. Very good. I think it's very important to say to the first part of your question that nothing that Donald Trump has said is new in the American cultural, political context. His identification of the deep swamp, the insider elite at Washington and their associated elite media, fake news, etc., is not new, but rather an animation of the long-standing suspicion of government in the United States, which, as I've said, has its robust and healthy democratic side, and also can have its suspicion of government per se aspect. And Trump was able to animate a very long-standing piece of American political culture. Similarly, with outsiders, new immigrants, a religious minority, Muslims, occasionally anti-Semitism as well. He was able to animate those long-standing thems of American culture. And when you asked why was he so effective, he was effective with all Americans, or with many Americans, in 2015-16, because these are very, very long-standing. And in the beginning, he was trying out what campaign slogans worked. And when he got a lot of applause, he continued using those slogans. And when you touch upon a long-standing them, one that feels right, that clicks, that is familiar, you're likely to get support for that. And Donald Trump did get support for his government animus and his outsider animus. And so he continued to employ it. But they're not new. Let me give you some examples. You know, America First was not Donald Trump's invention. Woodrow Wilson used that phrase in 1916 in his hopes of staying out of World War I. It was also used by Senator Bora from Idaho to keep the United States out of the League of Nations at the end of World War I. Drain the swamp was also not a Trump invention. It was used as a campaign promise by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And we can go on in like fashion. Now, the second half of your question, something more specific about evangelicals you wanted me to follow up. Could you go back to that, please?
Sure. I was asking, in what ways does the evangelical sense of cultural and political marginalization influence their embrace of Trump's rhetoric and policies on immigration and national identity?
Thank you for that. So let's go back to our core definition: duress, us then shift through culturally familiar thems. What are the duresses that white evangelicals are under? And these are real, and these are legitimate. They're under the duresses that many Americans are under. There's been a loss of purchasing power since the 1980s, a loss of unionization, a loss of jobs for which Americans had been trained, and a lack of job training for new jobs. There has been rapid technological changes in gender role. So we have the sense in America for significant portions of the population, including significant portions of white evangelicals, that life is harsher and harder today than it was for their parents. or grandparents, and that it is less fair, that it's just less fair. People work hard, they lose their jobs, or they're underemployed, or their communities are decimated when factories move out, or more importantly, when technological change increases the productivity, so you need far fewer workers on the job. And communities are decimated by this. These are legitimate and very real hardships that neither political party in the United States did much to alleviate until the Obama and Biden administrations. And several productive steps have been taken, but not enough. Evangelicals have specific losses in addition to those economic, but also way of life losses that I've just described. By way of life, I mean the sense that life is less fair and that your position in society as a respectable, middle-class kind of person is being threatened or undermined and eroded. And that you can't do anything about it because policies are being made by people far away who you have no way to reach and no way to influence. And those complaints have been quite real. On top of that, white evangelicals have suffered demographic loss. They used to be about 25% of the population in 2004. Now they're about 13% of the American population. They are the most aged of all religious groups in America, with average age of about 56. And there is a fear of loss of cultural sway in the United States. White evangelicalism had more, if we can use the term soft power, more cultural sway in American life. As American life changes, we have an uptick in secularization, in urbanization, in changing social mores. And white evangelicals are suffering a numbers loss and a cultural sway loss. And these are felt are real losses. And they contribute to the losses prodded by technological change, economic change, gender role change, etc. So evangelicals have, if we can summarize, a kind of double loss, the losses that all, not all, many Americans in the middle class and working class are suffering. And they have the losses that their particular religious group, white evangelicals, is suffering. They have double loss. And they also have a double source of suspicion of government, the suspicion that all Americans have, as we said, from covenantal thinking, republicanism, liberalism. They also have that suspicion of government from the doctrinal mandate, that is suspicion of priestly and other authorities. Right. So they have a kind of double loss and a double suspicion of government outsiders. And that's a very volatile combination if you're under duress and you're looking for a them that will feel familiar and explain the source of your very real difficulties in a way that is culturally familiar and understandable.
Right. You underlined that in late 2019, the mainstream influential evangelical publication, Christianity Today, ran an editorial calling for Trump's removal from office. Yet, in 2016 presidential election, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. How do you explain this strong bond despite forceful evangelical reservations?
So we recall that Americans in general are suspicious of authorities, and evangelicals are doubly suspicious of authorities. So Christianity Today, however influential a magazine, publishes an editorial that does not dictate how evangelicals across the country are going to react. They're going to react using their own minds and their own assessment of the situation and their own sense of duress, loss, threat, and their own ideas about what is the cause or source of that duress. Now, I am not at all surprised by an influential magazine publishing a piece criticizing Donald Trump, saying that he's unfit for office, and a substantial portion of evangelicals making their own decisions based on their own assessment.
All right. Can you elaborate on the concept of Christian nationalism and how it has been employed by white evangelicals to justify their support for Trump and right-wing populism?
Christian nationalism is a recent term and a very good one, developed by colleagues of mine who do excellent work. I'm not sure Christian nationalism is being used by white evangelicals. It might be that Christian nationalism is using white evangelicals. Let me explain what I mean. First of all, Christian nationalism is not a form of Christianity. It is a form of nationalism. The noun is nationalism.
Okay.
So it has as its goals the implementation of certain political, economic, and social policies. That's nationalism. It's a political position, not a faith tradition that follows Matthew 25 or seeks to relieve the hardship for the least of these. It is, I'm quoting from the Bible now, right? It is not a form of Christianity. It has concrete political, economic, and social goals. It is a political position that is said to be justified by certain readings or understandings of Christianity. Followers of Christian nationalism assert that their political positions are justified by their interpretation of Christian doctrine in the Bible. That's Christian nationalism. It's a political movement that by its members is said to be justified by their understanding of Christianity. Now, of course, there are many, many Christians in the United States who have a very, very different reading of Christianity and have been working very hard to make their brothers and sisters in Christ understand the many other ways of understanding Christianity besides that advocated by Christian nationalism. And that's about 25% of white, even 25% of white evangelicals who are undersung in the major media, whose activities are not sufficiently reported, and who are working very, very hard to really talk about other ways of understanding the Bible and Christian doctrine. Christian nationalism also is not a white evangelical invention or brand. Christian nationalism is very, very broad. It includes many people on the religious right, Catholics on the religious right, mainline Protestants in the religious right, as well as evangelicals. So Christian nationalism, again, as a right-wing political position, casts a much wider net than just white evangelicals. But insofar as white evangelicals have identified the thems in congruence with Christian nationalism thems, then white evangelicals will see themselves as Christian nationalists because they identify the same thems. But Christian nationalism is a much broader movement.
All right, Professor Pelly. Lastly, how do you think right-wing populism will be affected globally if Trump gets elected on November the 5th?
Right-wing movements globally communicate with each other. This, by the way, is nothing special. Left-wing movements do also, centrist movements do also, governments also communicate, NGOs globally communicate. This is not a surprise. But right-wing populist movements communicate. And they look at each other's successes and failures and try to learn from them. If Trump is elected in November, I would imagine that right-wing groups and right-wing leaders, or those who want to become leaders on the right, will look to the strategies and rhetoric and promises of the Trump campaign and try to learn from them and apply them in their own contexts.
All right. Professor Pelly, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate your time.